hog do their own presentations. And for the Q&A session, I would request that you send all your questions to our moderator, that's Ling Hao Kang, and like you can definitely see him. He's the co-host, so you can like easily message him, and he will be fielding all questions and directing them to speakers towards the end at a Q&A session. So thank you, and so that's all from me. And now I'm going to hand it off to Kara. Kara, off to you. Thank you. Kara, you're muted.
Catherine, I can't seem to share the slides.
You want me to jump on with them?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kara Ferber, and I am the Advocacy and Policy Director of Pink Concussions. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to collaborate with Columbia Synapse and address the critical goal to increase awareness, activism, research, and medical care for the extensive population of women experiencing intimate partner violence during the current healthcare crisis of COVID-19. My personal journey of recovery and rehabilitation following a traumatic brain injury acquired in a car accident while I attended Cornell Law School inspired me to become an advocate. I met Catherine Snedeker, the founder and executive director of Pink Concussions, on Congressional Brain Injury Awareness Day in Washington, D.C. I was thrilled to learn about this organization and collaborate to pursue our valuable goals of increasing healthcare access and equity for women who experience traumatic brain injury. Switch this. Pink Concussions is the first nonprofit organization established in 2015 to focus on pre-injury education and post-injury medical care for women and girls with mild to severe brain injury incurred from sports, violence, accidents, or military service. Our mission is development and implementation of sex-specific, gender-responsive, evidence-based strategies for the identification, management, and support of women and girls with brain injuries. We achieve our objective through professional and public education, medical conferences, media coverage, research, advocacy, and support groups for an extensive number of women and girls. We have and continue to strive to increase medical and science research, knowledge, and awareness through multiple avenues, including more than 100 presentations and webinars, networking opportunities, and brain injury international summits, where clinicians and researchers, as well as those who experienced traumatic brain injury, present. For example, Pink Concussions, consisting of a panel of survivors due to causes including military service, sports, assault, domestic violence, and myself as a motor vehicle accident survivor, presented to share our stories at the World Congress on Brain Injury in Toronto, Canada. Our pioneering initiatives have led to visibility, diagnosis, and treatment for girls and women who have typically been misdiagnosed, mistreated, and isolated after acquiring brain injury. The invisibility of brain injury is a significant reason for not receiving proper diagnosis, healthcare, and rehabilitation to enable healing and recovery. As a consequence of this, long-term consequences, health consequences, do emerge and often lead to self-blame, feelings of disempowerment, and lack of self-respect that can inhibit the potential for healing, daily functioning, maintenance of relationships, and capacity to succeed at work or at school. Pink Concussions strives to increase awareness and understanding of these challenges for both the individuals who experience this and the clinicians and therapists and everybody who could treat them, and help provide a support and a pathway to care. Pink leadership is composed of healthcare professionals who enable us to accomplish this mission. Chris Giza, Angela Colantonio, and Ron Savage are strong leaders that have helped lead us to grow to the extent that we have. In addition, we have a professional advisory board, and these leaders all are just an extensive leadership, different rehabilitation institutes, medical centers, and as well as nonprofit organizations that help to provide access and care for women. As I said earlier, we have these extensive Facebook groups and also Twitter following of 10,000 followers. So really just the conversation is ongoing for all people within our organization, the broad spectrum, to be able to communicate about all different topics. The specialized Facebook groups that we have are each focused on some particular causes, as well as different age groups, and for caregivers as well, as you see, so they can communicate about ongoing, living life, life issues or challenges that arise, and to get feedback from other people who are experiencing the same thing. Mild to severe brain injury is too frequently inflicted upon women who live as victims of domestic violence. Yet this is typically undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and mistreated. So this is one spectrum of the groups which we have, and that's actually a confidential group for people to coordinate, to communicate, and be able to support each other. One of the other initiatives that Pink has taken that we actually announced at the NIH conference is that we set up the system called the Pink Brain Pledge. And that way that women who were actually excluded from research that was being done on brains and on neurology, to make sure that there was an understanding about the gender differences and the impact and the ways that different treatments could be able to help heal. So we initiated this, and now we have brain banks really internationally, that once you take the Pink Brain Pledge, then we can connect you to these institutions. Now, the women who live as victims of domestic violence, the brain injury that they experience is, as I said, undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, and mistreated. So social workers, mental health counselors, and clinicians, inclusive of neurologists, internists, gynecologists, psychologists, and pediatricians, all have impactful roles on the pathway to care for women. Screening, diagnosis, medical, and neuropsychological evaluations and treatments are all critical steps for a woman to live and actually, to survive through this trauma. Violent hits to the head and the body, being strangled or choked, can cause a brain injury. And this type of violence-inflicted brain injury has rarely been studied and is often misdiagnosed. Misdiagnosed, recurring, and mistreated. The Pink Concussions Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury Task Force seeks to improve the lives of those impacted by intimate partner violence, including physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse within and outside of the home, by creating an open space for learning and support and collaboration. Catherine Price-Snedeker is an innovative, inspiring leader and role model who has made a very valuable impact as founder and executive director of Pink Concussions. She will speak about the Intimate Partner Task Force and our recent accomplishments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I apologize, I was not on the right slide all the time for your great talk. So I think I'm fired as slide advancer. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you so much for Columbia Synapse to invite us to be a part of this day. I'm really excited too about the speakers today. Lynn and Eve have been a very big part of our journey for the last couple of years, and are also on the task force of this Partner-Inflicted brain injury task force that we've put together that include people on both coasts, people in Canada, people in the Midwest, Catherine Iverson from the VA. We currently have 214 members across 10 countries. You can sign up and join the task force at pinkconcussions.org/violence. And we have Zoom calls the last Tuesday of the month. This coming Tuesday is our September call, and we are really excited to have a presentation on domestic violence, IPV violence against the transgender community. And we also do recordings so you can play those back. Also like to talk to you about Brain Injury Professional, which I'm very excited to be the guest editor, and it has an article by Eve in this article, in this issue, and it also has a section on Lynn's project that she'll explain to you later. You can read that now at braininjuryprofessional.com, and again, it's a free magazine right there. So I just wanted to tell you one last thing before I introduce Eve, is that I noticed I have a blog post on our website where I talk about the global view of domestic violence and IPV during COVID. And one of the things that I noticed for the first time is domestic violence articles were coming out along with COVID articles. And in the past, domestic violence articles about a particular incident, a celebrity where domestic violence had occurred, or a tragic case that got the attention of a reporter. And what I noticed with COVID is we started having articles, and I look back, and the first ones was on March 2nd, and it was said domestic violence cases surged during the COVID epidemic, and that was in China, and another one on the 7th. And again, I'm only reading the English articles in China, but China's domestic violence epidemic. The first article happened in Asia on March 8th, and the first American article on March 12th. So on our website, I have pulled together the articles over the first 2 months of COVID. And what was interesting to me is it was talking about domestic violence and really bringing an attention to domestic violence as a phenomenon across all races, across all socioeconomic, that it was a world issue as opposed to being around one celebrity. So that I'm really hoping that if there is any pink lining in COVID, that domestic violence can really finally have the attention that it is a global epidemic. So I'd like to now introduce Eve, and I also want to do a shout out to Christine Brown Fisher, one of our slides. And Christine is a member of Columbia Synapse, and I know she's on this call, and she wrote that article on the root, and we're very proud of that article talking about domestic violence in the Black community. So I want to shout out to her and the work that she's doing. So to introduce Eve, I just love Eve. I got to say, Eve's one of my favorite people, so it's very exciting to introduce her. Eve officially is the Associate Professor in Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a research scientist at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's worked nearly 25 years to understand the consequences of traumatic brain injury resulting from intimate partner violence, and has authored nearly 50 publications, is a reviewer of more than 60 journals, and has obtained numerous grants to support her research. Her work has been featured in numerous news sources, TV News, NYT Magazine, Forbes, CBC Canada Radio, and she's actively engaged in training stakeholders, not taking her research from the lab out into the community. And that includes shelter workers, law enforcement, judicial personnel, and raising awareness of this public health epidemic. Eve's just amazing. She inspires me all the time. And one fun fact is Eve has a ferret and a rabbit along with her husband and her son in Boston. So without any ado, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Eve to take the lead.
Can you hear me? Oh, wait, I may not have. You can hear me and see?
You're good now, Eve.
Phew. Okay. So thank you so much for having me and recognizing this issue, and basically doing all the legwork to get people together to learn about this super, super important but incredibly underappreciated topic. I hope to basically kind of, you know, I don't really want to do it in a lot of reasons, but I kind of think I'm going to blow your minds today with some of the numbers that I'm going to present. And hopefully it will, because it really, even when I know this is the case, it kind of blows my mind all the time too. Some of the statistics and figures that I'm going to give you today are hard to believe. And I think it's easy and convenient for people to think, oh, that can't really happen, or that only happens to those people over there. And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case, that this, partner violence happens everywhere. And it's something that we all need to be appreciating as something that is living all around us, and that we know people, even if we don't know it, who are experiencing or have experienced partner violence. So with that said, I hope you pay really close attention, so that if there is somebody who is still around you who needs help, maybe you can engage with them and help them out if possible. Okay, so intimate partner violence. So I'm just going to try to make this little thing a little bit smaller here. Intimate partner violence, just to define for anyone who doesn't, why can't I go forward? Is there an issue here? There we go. Is simply violence perpetrated by a current or former spouse, partner, significant other, boyfriend, or girlfriend. It does not have to be someone you are living with. And if you want to think about domestic violence, it's a part of domestic violence, but domestic violence also includes things like child abuse or elder abuse. So partner violence basically just means somebody that you have an intimate relationship with, and even if you're not living with them, it's still partner violence. Sadly, intimate partner violence is the leading cause of homicide for women globally. So if a woman has been murdered, your most likely guess, if you had to make one guess, would be that she was killed by somebody who was her partner. And it's the most common form of violence against women. Again, a really horribly sad statistic, that we're injured most commonly by the people who we think we love and trust. Traverses all socioeconomic boundaries. This is not just, as I was saying earlier, the people over there. I will say that it does not affect all folks equally. Just like COVID disproportionately affects people who have less, people of color, et cetera. It is unfortunate that people, who have less tend to get the worst deal in a lot of different areas. And this is one of those cases as well. But there are certainly people who are very wealthy, who are living in relationships where they're getting battered and abused. And I actually have been working with somebody not too long ago who is with an incredibly wealthy family, but is still nonetheless in this situation. We wouldn't necessarily see her in a study for various reasons, but these people are out there. This is not just limited to people who do not have enough. The sad state of affairs is that 1 in 3 women report experiencing at least one instance of physical or sexual intimate partner violence. This is anybody over the age of 15. And this is globally. So if we take the world, and these are all the women in the world, this many people are experiencing or have experienced some type of physical or sexual partner violence. That's really kind of a horrible statistic to me. And what that tells me is that we all must know somebody, because if you think of 10 people I think, if you're going to go by, the statistics, you have to think of 10 women, I should say, what 3 women have experienced physical or sexual partner violence. Because by the odds, that if 10 women, 3 of them who have experienced this. And the reason I sort of hammer these numbers home is because really what this tells me is that these are our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, our friends, our colleagues, our partners. These women are all around us. It's us. It's not them. It's us. And I think if we think of it that way, we can hopefully feel even more engaged in this topic and feel more of a sense of urgency of addressing this topic in the way it really deserves to be addressed. Another unfortunate fact is that women endure violent abuse to the head with an estimated 80 to 90% of injuries to the neck and higher. Women that I have interviewed have been beaten in the head with bats, smashed in the head with hammers, punched in the head repeatedly with fists, stomped on the head with work boots, thrown downstairs, have had refrigerators thrown on them, thrown off porches onto hard cement floors. I could go on, and I'm not trying to be, what's the word? Like provocative to say like, oh, this is, I'm not every single woman who has experienced intimate partner violence will experience this, but these are not uncommon events. I did not have to search to find stories like this. So when you think of that, it kind of makes sense that women may be experiencing intimate partner violence. But when I started doing this work a while ago, there wasn't really much talk about that at all. We're starting to gain a little bit of traction, and people are recognizing that this is a problem. And from work that I have done and others, we are now realizing that the majority of women experiencing IPV sustain IPV-related brain injury. Now, I want to, full disclosure here, these are data based on a study that I have, studies that I've done that are arguably convenient samples, and they may not be huge samples, but it's what we have so far. We're currently working on a paper where we're trying to gather all of the information we can about the prevalence of IPV-related TBI as it's been measured. I don't think we have any really, really good studies so far that have done that. So that's just full disclosure. But when you see the numbers that I present here, you should be worried regardless of whether or not these are truly accurate or just a little bit off or something like that. So I actually investigated this in a sample of 99 women. And I'm going to give this to you in terms of numbers in the United States. So anybody who's watching in Canada, it may not apply. But if we were to take women who have experienced intimate partner violence in the United States, in average based on census numbers, about 38 million women over the age of 15 have experienced some type of physical or sexual partner violence. That number alone is kind of sad. What I found was that if you extrapolate from numbers, I found that 74% of the women in my sample of 99 women experienced at least one mild traumatic brain, or at least one traumatic brain injury from their partners. Now, if you had to extrapolate that, which we can't really do, I'm just sort of saying if we were to do that, that'd be 28 million. Okay. What's even worse is that 51% of the women that I interviewed sustained repetitive traumatic brain injuries. And for some of these women, it was too many to count. Now, if you extrapolate these numbers, it's nearly 20 million. So the reason I put these numbers up here, even though I don't think they're great estimates of what we genuinely know, because we have to do the right study. But if you were to slash these numbers, even in half or in a quarter, look at the number, the millions and millions of women who are potentially walking around with repetitive mild traumatic brain injuries. So I can't express enough the urgency of getting the data, of knowing how many women are actually experiencing brain injuries, doing good epidemiological data and finding out the problem, how big the problem is. But for now, what we know is that it happens a lot. And there's no reason to think that it doesn't happen a lot based on these and other data. What I also found in that sample was that IPV-related TBIs are associated with poor cognitive and psychological outcomes. Having more traumatic brain injuries was associated with poor performance on tests of memory, learning, and ability to go back and forth quickly between tasks, so cognitive flexibility. And more TBIs was associated with higher ratings of general distress, depression, worry, anxiety, and traumatic stress. So really basically a double whammy where you have women who are, now basically potentially having cognitive issues because they have brain injuries, and then they may be depressed or anxious. And then if they want to get out of the relationship, which is already an incredibly challenging prospect, put on top of that cognitive and potential psychological issues, and it becomes nearly impossible. One thing that I think is important to note is that in this study, I did make sure that what I was seeing was not just accounted for by the fact that the abuse may have been more severe. We can talk about it later if you're interested, but trust me when I say that it wasn't just the severity of the abuse, it was actual brain injuries. And also for the cognitive scores, it wasn't just the fact that they were depressed or on substance abuse or something like that. And that's what accounted for these scores, because we controlled for that as well. So the next study I did, I basically was using basically magnetic resonance imaging, because I wanted to see if we could see what we see in the other populations of individuals who have sustained brain injuries. What we can see, what would have they've been measured in other populations, but we haven't been measuring this in women at all. In fact, the 2 studies that I'm going to tell you about are the only 2 neuroimaging studies examining IPV-related TBI to date that I know of, and I don't think anything else has been published, but if someone does know, I'd love to hear. And so the reason we want to use magnetic resonance imaging is it gives us an insight into what the brain may look like, and it can also tell us about structural and functional connectivity. Structural connectivity merely involves parts of the brain cells that connect different brain regions, so they may be right next to each other. And functional connectivity involves regions of the brain that are working together, but not necessarily right next to each other. Okay, so we have both types of connectivity within the brain. And what we know from years of doing neuroscience is that both functional and structural connectivity are critical for optimal brain function and ultimately for optimal behavior. So what we also know is that when we think about concussions, it's not just this, but we know that concussions involve injury to brain cells that can affect structural and functional connectivity. And here what we can see is a picture of a neuron. We have the cell body, and here's the axon, and here's the dendrites. And you can see the axon is thin and long. And so when you have a really strong force to the head, so acceleration, deceleration, or rotational forces, you can actually tear or damage this part of the brain cell, and that can cause problems. The neuron may be injured so that it cannot communicate with another neuron, or maybe it's just not as efficient at communicating. But we have long believed that concussions involve this type of damage to the brain, and that's why you may not even see concussion as just another term for a mild traumatic brain injury, but just using a term that's familiar to a lot of people. So if you have an MRI or a CAT scan, for example, you may not see any damage in one specific area of the brain, because there may be what we call diffuse axonal injury. Diffuse because it's in different parts of the brain, axonal because it's affecting this part of the neuron, and injury obviously because it's an injury. So we might call that DAI. So at any rate, knowing this, I wanted to look at both functional and structural connectivity in the brain and how it may relate to the number of brain injuries that a woman who's experiencing partner violence has received. And what I found was that the number of mild traumatic brain injuries is related to, and in this case it was mild traumatic brain injuries, was related to functioning of some of the long axons or fibers that we see. And this is a picture of the human brain. And these are color-coded axons. They're color-coded just according to the direction of the water molecules that are moving within the axons. And what we know is that the longer axons, so this is an example of one of the longer axons, are most likely to be damaged. So I looked at 3 regions right in here. And you don't necessarily need, I don't know the neuroscience level of some of the people who are on this call, but we don't necessarily need to know the names, but I will say it was the posterior and superior coronal radiata. And what we found was that the number of brain injuries a woman sustained was inversely associated with fractional anisotropy in the posterior and superior coronal radiata. And fractional anisotropy, or FA, is just a measure of how the water molecules are moving within the axon, and is often used as a measure to understand how the brain is functioning in sports, in regular, in various different types of studies that you may look at, psychiatric, et cetera. And so what has been found in another study, for example, in a football study they looked at, was that those regions were also shown to be affected in individuals who sustained repetitive concussions from football. And so we basically sort of replicated that here for women who would experience intimate partner violence. I also looked at and that was an example of structural connectivity. So in terms of functional connectivity, we found that the functional network communication was associated with a number of IPV-related TBIs and cognition. And so what I looked at, again, based on previous work that was done on other brain injured populations, was I looked at the connection between this region here, roughly, the right anterior insula, which is in the salience network. And I looked at how this may relate to other regions that are in the default network. And in this case, the posterior cingulate precuneus was a region that we identified in the default network as showing basically a differing relationship than what normals may see. And so we basically looked specifically at the connection between the right anterior insula and several nodes within the default network. And what we found was that the more recent and the greater number of traumatic brain injuries a woman had, the less positively these two brain regions communicated with one another. Also, the less these two brain regions communicated with one another, the worse the woman tended to be able to learn a list of words and remember that list of words 20 minutes later. Okay. So what I've shown here is that not only do we have relationships between brain injuries and tests of neuropsychological functioning and depression and anxiety, but we can also see relationships between number of brain injuries and functional and structural connectivity in women's brains. So that's the science. And now the science that I have done for the most part, there's other stuff, but we don't have a lot of time. And so for the last little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about, that's sort of some of the science. So we know this is important, right? And now I want to say, okay, so what can we do? And how would we recognize this? What does this kind of look like? And what can we expect? And so I say TBI victim reporting. And some people may not like the term victim, and I can appreciate that. I could say TBI survivor reporting. I like using the term victim sometimes because I really think that, if a crime has been committed against you, then you are a victim. And that's really what this is. But they're also survivors, and the women have gone through, the women that I have interviewed or heard about are stronger than most of the people I know in my life, I will say for sure. So at any rate, that side note aside, what might someone say? I sustained a brain injury? Probably not. We're arguing that I found myself getting up from the floor? Maybe. He punched me in my head? Maybe. I fell backwards and hit the wall. I'm not sure how I got into the other room. And so the reason I put it this way is because don't expect, even if you know first of all, you may not know that somebody that you know is in a partner violent relationship. But if you do, don't expect that they're going to come to you and say, hey, I just had a brain injury. They may say something like one of these things. And if they do say one of these things, I kind of want you to be alert and maybe follow up, as we're going to talk about in a minute. And what's really important, and which many of you on this call may already know, is there are no visible signs of injury to the naked eye or via imaging. Concussions, unless it's a complicated concussion, will not show up positive on a standard MRI or CT scan. So you can't go by that, but you have to do other things, which are actually easier than getting an MRI. The other thing to know is that people rarely seek medical attention. When women do seek medical attention from partner violence situations, it's often for things that you kind of can't get around. You have a broken arm, you're bleeding, maybe you have a punctured lung or something like that. That's the more typical types of things that women seek medical attention for. And they may go in to an emergency room or something and have a whole host of things that are kind of wrong. And one of them may be that they had their head smashed, and because they're being bandaged, et cetera, it may not even really be a consideration that she may have sustained a brain injury. So it all has to be asked about. You can't expect it to just be something that people are going to be, bringing up. So what do you ask if a TBI is suspected? Well, my recommendation, and this is just how I've done it in my studies, is to basically if you have other information, that's one thing. I don't have a lot of time to go into that. But short of any other kind of information, if you're trying to find out if someone has sustained a brain injury or from a violent partner, or you think they may have, this is all you really need to do to find out. You say, after anything that he or she did to you, did you ever lose consciousness or black out? Did you ever not remember part or have memory loss around the incident? Feel confused, disoriented, feel stunned or dazed, see stars or spots? These are different things. I don't have the time to go through individually, but just as an example, you can ask them. If they say, it's something he or she did to me and I was really confused, then you find out what happened. And was it that it was something that could impact the brain in a very forceful, traumatically forceful way. So for example, he hit me against the wall, he shook me violently, he punched me in the head. If they say something like that and they have had a loss of consciousness or were confused or couldn't remember part of it, that's a concussion. Now, if drugs are involved and they can't remember part of it because of a drug situation or something, I mean, there's a little bit of a complexity here. But nonetheless, that's all it takes to diagnose someone as having a concussion. It doesn't take any more than that. So I think people think there's a magic thing that a doctor has to diagnose it or you have to get a scan, and that's not the case. If someone's head is hit in some, traumatically forceful way, and that person loses consciousness even for a moment, that's a concussion. Okay, so basically that's how you can find out. You basically ask these questions. If there's been some type of trauma to the head or some type of force to the head, and then it results in one of these symptoms that I've listed here on the slide, you can safely assume that either they've had a concussion or, you may definitely want to consider the possibility that they may have had a concussion. And then you may want to look for some of the potential sequelae of mild TBIs, or if it's a moderate or severe TBI, maybe the more obvious. But these are basically signs and symptoms of somebody who has sustained basically traumatic brain injury. So you may have cognitive problems, which may include memory, decreased concentration, impaired judgment. Physical problems, headaches are a huge one, maybe problems with sleep or balance or dizziness or nausea. Emotional problems could be anxiety, depression, restlessness, aggressiveness, things that may seem inappropriate. And this may occur right away or maybe even a little bit later. And so you want to be alert to these types of changes. And then what to expect when looking for evidence of a TBI. Unfortunately, if you show up, somebody who has sustained a TBI may appear to be someone who's disoriented, confused, distractible, inconsistent, having headaches, uncooperative, dizzy, maybe off balance. So the point is and especially if the TBI is acute, and you have someone who's reporting something like this, that may seem like someone who is, when you look at this list, it may look like someone who's intoxicated if you don't think about the possibility of a traumatic brain injury. This may look like someone who's on a substance, because that's exactly what, if someone's really drunk, they may look disoriented, confused, distractible, etc. And so the idea here is to always entertain the idea that someone may have sustained a TBI if they're in a partner violence situation and you see something like this, or maybe there was some yelling, and don't jump to the conclusion, if you see a beer on the table, that that's what's been going on, that it's just that they're drunk or something like that. So recommendations for working with women with TBI, and this is, just in general, how you would interact with anyone who may have had a TBI, not necessarily just, partner violence. And so I'm just going to go through these really quickly because I know I probably have about 3 or 4 minutes left. But basically, it's minimizing distractions, meeting in quiet locations, having short meetings, taking breaks, avoid loud noises and bright lights, repeat information to make sure they get it, prioritize goals, help them to do that because that can be really hard to do. Make smaller steps or write them out. Talk slowly and to the point, not like I'm talking right now because I'm trying to get through these slides. Double check with her to be sure that she understood the information. Just because you said it, and even if you said it a couple of times, if you don't ask her to repeat back to you, she may not have gotten it at all. And then there's the question of fitness, which I always feel compelled to include because I want to make sure that the information I present is not taken and used in a bad way. So one of the things that has been done, something weird just happened to that slide. Oh, that wasn't me. Okay. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't me. So having a TBI does not necessarily make someone unfit. Okay. It may make it harder to establish a safety plan, make it harder for a woman to leave an abusive situation, make it more difficult for a woman to successfully obtain an order of protection. And these are some of the things that may be more difficult for a woman who has experienced a brain injury, but it does not mean that she is unfit, for example, to take care of her children. And that is the one thing that I think we all want to be very careful about, because if this, if the idea that women are sustaining brain injury catches on and people recognize this and believe it and see it for what it is, then you could have lawyers saying, oh, well, she shouldn't have the kids because she's had a brain injury. And then this is saying, no, I could go on and on, but this does not mean that she is unfit. And so we want go to the right resources to make sure you know that. And don't be afraid to say you have a brain injury because you're afraid that this may be how someone may categorize you. I don't have a lot of time so I like to do this, but I'm almost out of time. I think a lot of people don't understand, why don't women just leave, right? And I understand that because some of the things that women go through is so horrific. It's hard to imagine that anything would be better. But trust me, when I say that women aren't leaving just because, they just want to be in this relationship, they're lazy, they like being abused. There are so many ways that abusers can basically force them into staying. And these are just some of them: by fear, intimidation tactics, threatening, to kill pets or threatening to kill them. Women are most likely to be murdered when they're leaving or trying to leave. So these are all real fears. The last thing I want to leave on is about COVID-19. I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to go this quickly. But basically, as I think many of us may know, IPV-related TBIs is likely escalating since COVID-19 because we don't know about TBIs per se. We know that rates of IPV are spiking. We do know that from police reports and from calls to shelters and stuff. There are some places that have been showing maybe some like, we're getting fewer calls. Usually what happens there is that when the calls do come in, the severity of the violence is actually higher. So sometimes it may be that women can't actually call easily because they're locked up with the abuser. But then when things get really bad, or then they ultimately end up in the ER because the violence has escalated, and now they kind of can't hold back from calling or seeking help. We know that rates of homicides are escalating. Rates in the UK like doubled. They haven't seen anything like this in I forget how many years. In Mexico, there's like 1,000 murders. That was like an 8% increase from last year. And so we know that if rates of IPV are spiking and homicides are escalating and severity of violence are escalating, the likelihood that TBIs are escalating is very high. But we don't really have those data yet. We just don't. But mitigation strategies to reduce women's ability to escape the violence itself or the situation more generally. And what we know is that historically heightened rates of domestic violence service demands are seen even a year after the event or the crisis. So even when COVID is over, women are not out of the woods. And the last thing I want to do is I just want to leave you with one example of how COVID has affected certain countries, women who are experiencing intimate partner violence in certain countries. So in Uganda, there's a transport ban, which means that you couldn't drive because of COVID. So you basically weren't allowed to use a vehicle. And it turned out that cases of domestic violence were up from 1,137 in 2019 to 3,280. And calls were up from 9 to 56 per week. So this is a huge increase in domestic violence. But the president didn't really think it was really an important enough thing to set aside some safety mechanisms for. And he basically said that domestic violence is not life-threatening and should not be considered so during the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of lifting the transport ban for women who may need help in a domestic violence situation. He says, we're dealing with a few things that are life-threatening: childbirth, snakebite, heart attack. Finish. What else is there? We're not dealing with all problems. Somebody is drunk and is beating his wife. No, no, no. And I would like to say that is the feeling of just one president, of Uganda. But unfortunately, I think that's what a lot of people tend to think, that this is not that big of a deal and doesn't necessarily, need special attention. But it really does. And in one case that we saw, this story, this was brought up in this article. Basically, a woman came home and her husband picked up a sharp object and stabbed her in the right eye. He then beat her, and when she blacked out, he fled. The neighbors heard the screams, and because they couldn't drive because of the transport ban, they had to carry her to the nearest hospital, which I think took 2 or 3 times longer than it would have if they could have driven. So at any rate, if you think about this story too, the likelihood that she hasn't sustained a TBI is pretty low. But in the article, it didn't say anything about brain injury. It just talked about her other injuries. So I'm going to wrap up with that. And I basically like to end by saying IPV-related TBIs are very common and dangerous, and it is our job to recognize and intervene. I don't care who we are, we really should be doing better by the women that are around us, and our friends and our family who we love and care for. There is a film that is premiering this weekend at the Boston Film Festival. This hits home. I happen to be part of that film. I do not make any money from it, so I'm not necessarily promoting it. I'm just, putting it out there as a resource for people who want to see a film that touches on basically IPV-related TBI. I will say, full disclosure, that in the film, there's a little bit more, they focus a little bit more on chronic traumatic encephalopathy and the possibility that that could be a long-term outcome for women who've experienced partner violence, which I personally wouldn't have done. I think it's definitely a possibility, but there are other things that we know, like the data that I presented here, that would have been, I think, more helpful to have been included in the film, because we know that, whereas the CTE is sort of a question that we need to study going forward. But otherwise, I think it gives some nice insight into some abuse, some survivor stories, and just hopefully, I just hope it will put IPV-related TBI sort of on the more global map, and so that it's not just a few of us who are interested in it who know about it. Thanks so much for having me. Sorry, I went actually a couple minutes over. My apologies.
Well, thank you so much, Eve. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on what is actually a global epidemic of IPV-related TBI. And I think sharing those research insights is also very compelling evidence for how severely this is such an issue. And I think that's a really good segue into our next speaker, Lynn Hogg, who will kind of focus more on the social dimensions of engagement with the community and the work she's done as a social worker. But I'll hand it over to you, Lynn Hogg, to introduce yourself and share the work that you do. Thank you.
I was actually it's Catherine, I was gonna introduce Lynn, if I may. Awesome. She is the contract faculty member and a PhD candidate in social work at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, Canada. And I've known Lynn for a number of years now, and she's been a PhD candidate for years. So in my mind, she's already a PhD. Her work focuses on the gendered experience of traumatic brain injury and the impact of mental health, return to work, social integration encountered by brain injured women survivors of intimate partner violence. Lynn is committed to improving the outcomes through direct practice, innovative research, and professional education, and believes that increased knowledge and understanding is key. As someone with lived experience of TBI, she's been a guest speaker addressing the issues of disability, brain injury, and marginalization for a variety of international academic, professional, and community-based organizations. In her off hours, you can find her with her horses or in her garden. She's just another incredible person. I'm so glad that she's in my world, and here she is to speak to you today.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I hope. That doesn't seem to be, you guys don't have my slides, do you?
We
Catherine?
can.
Oh goodness. Catherine, I'm going to email them to you, but that's not going to work because it needs to share the screen for the toolkit. So.
I think it would work. You can email them to me and I'll pull them up.
Okay.
It's all about being a cooperative world here.
Yeah. Don't know how that gets us through the toolkit, but by then probably figure it out.
Chinmay, possibly you could just share the slide.
Yeah, I can share my screen. I can try. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
I can see it.
Great. I will go on full screen and we can just prompt say next slide and I can definitely move along for you.
No problem. So hi folks. My name is Lynn Hogg. I am, as Catherine points out, a perpetual PhD student at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I'm a perpetual PhD student because I actually kind of like it on this side of the fence. So I have a lot of flexibility and a lot of power to do things. And I've managed to make it into something that really allows me to make a great balance between academic work and practice work. So for me, that's always been something that's really important, and I've enjoyed that. And thank you very much, Catherine, for the vote of confidence in my eventual completion of this program. I'm working on it. I'll get there. Go ahead and move the next slide. So this slide pops up a couple of times. It's mostly to keep me on point, but it's also for those of you in the crowd that like me have some cognitive challenges in terms of organization and keeping on track. This is what I want you to be able to walk away with today. Some key practice concerns, which, I mean, I could take a day or two to talk to you about that, but we tried to pull out a few that were really important. What can you do about it in your practice, in your day-to-day life, in supporting a friend, a family member, whatever it needs to be. And then we'll show you the toolkit that we built one way or another, so that you can see what you can do and where you can go to get some information. Next slide, please. So this is the only, even I had a little bit of chit chat before today, and this is the only science slide that I'm going to hand out there. And you've talked about this, the numbers, we're not sure. There are so many reasons in the science why we're not sure, and it has nothing to do with whether or not this is actually existing. It has to do with how we as researchers go about finding people who will talk to us, where they are, what kind of circumstances they're in. Are we getting what's called a representative sample, or are we cherry picking basically out of groups that we know are going to have high numbers? And in many cases, the challenges with this group are there because this is such a unique group of people, and the difficulties that we can face as researchers in finding them, in reaching them, in it being safe for them to talk to us, all those kinds of things get rolled in. So we have really big spreads in this group, and I like to play it really safe. So we've got a spread from 19 to 75%. E's on the top of that with her work. That's where that one's coming from. Some earlier work showed numbers as low as 19%. That is survivors who are likely to have traumatic brain injury as a result of exposure to IPV. So once we do some math and we calculate that out, I take a different approach from Eve in terms of using a small number. And if you see in the middle of the photograph here, you got 1 in 8. If you're looking at 1 in 3 to 4 women will experience IPV over their lifetime. And if we take a really conservative slice of that 19 to 75, and we say 50% of those are likely experiencing traumatic brain injury as a result of that violence, that gets your 1 in 8 figure. And what I find really impressive about that, and the reason I throw it into every single talk, you'll notice the number 1 is written in pink. It's because it's the same statistic as breast cancer. Now, if you think about the money, the research, the focus, the acceptability, the healthcare, all of it that is going into breast cancer around the world, and you have 2 of about 8 of us in the world who are looking at IPV and traumatic brain injury on this call. So I think it's really important to recognize that this is a significant health issue. It is a significant issue for women, although it does absolutely happen to men, trans women, people across a spectrum. There's no doubt about that. It's just statistically much higher that it's going to be a woman on the receiving end of the violence. You can move that along then again, thanks. So enough science, on to practice. These were 4 sort of areas that I think are really important. We've got screening, we've got communication, which I sort of tie in a little bit with relationship. As a social worker, I think that's a critical issue. We can't do anything for anybody that we can't build relationship with. If they don't trust us, there's not a lot we can do. And that's on us, I think, in many ways. Then we have a significant challenge with substance misuse in this population, and there's a crossover between that. So a lot of people with TBI will experience challenges using substances, misusing substances. A lot of people with substance use challenges also have TBIs, post-substance use. And then a lot of that rolls right into IPV. A lot of people dealing with IPV are using substances in order to cope. as a coping mechanism. So there's a fine line between use and misuse, and a lot of the time that gets blurred here. And then we've got a big mental health challenge here for these folks as well. Next slide, please. So the first one, communication. Anybody who knows anybody with a traumatic brain injury, this is not a difficult one for you to understand. We're often quite challenging to talk to. We tend to think in circles a lot of the time. We often bunny hop around conversations. We tend to have interesting ways of engaging in conversation. A lot of the time, sometimes we're quite reticent. Other times we overpower a conversation. Often you'll find people have difficulty with memory, and that goes two ways. It's both about storage and recall. So for a lot of us, I refer to what I call the Swiss cheese effect. It just never got in there in the first place, let alone my trying to retrieve it. And in other cases, it's about trying to pull it out of the system when you need it at the time. We're often slow to follow and process information. That has to do with reducing the speed of the processing itself, as well as the amount that you can shove in there at any given time, as well as being able to work with complex concepts. So it has to do with, if you simplify, if you make little bits, little chunks at a time, it becomes much easier. Slow it down, much easier. We also have often very limited spans of attention and concentration. So, I mean, I can focus in for a period of time and get stuff done. But after that, you know, sort of 20 minutes, half an hour, and I need a break. And that happens with any sort of, if I'm reading, just as much as if I'm watching TV or if I'm listening to a lecture or a talk. And the more that you have things going on around you, the more that that's going to have an impact on your capacity to do that. Next slide, please. Just to take a step back, I caught it just as it disappeared. One of the reasons that that's really important for those of us on the front lines and for anybody who's offering service is that it's so easy to misread the other person's behavior. So what often we hear from frontline when we're doing research is that they're fed up with clients who can't keep appointments, or who are defiant and who swear a lot, or who laugh when it's inappropriate, or who can't be bothered to do the homework that they've asked them to do, things like that. And they read that as behavioral choices on the part of their client. And I think it's really important that we understand, sitting on the other side of the desk, that these things may well not be choices at all. The woman may not be aware of them, or even worse, she may be aware of them and seeing them as her own deficit. You know, I'm stupid, or I can't do what you're asking me to do. I'm not good enough. That kind of internal self-talk happens a lot. It's also fed by an abuser. So I think it's really important that those of us on this side of the desk think about why someone is displaying these behaviors, particularly if you're working with someone with a traumatic brain injury that's been diagnosed and understood. You're not surprised at those behaviors. You're only surprised by them when you don't know that there's a brain injury involved. So in this group of survivors, I think we need to start thinking about whether or not there's a brain injury taking part in this and how that changes things. And that's that relationship communication piece. Sorry, so now we're looking at the substance use and addiction slide. We have seriously high rates of substance misuse in this population, 80% plus. And that's both in the traumatic brain injury population and in the IPV population. And then you roll them together and you're just ending up with exponential situations. And it's the other challenge, and Eve alluded to this, is that often IPV-related TBI can present as substance misuse and can be overlooked as a result. So cops knocking on the door, sees a bunch of beer bottles on the table, maybe some paraphernalia of some sort, and assumes that because the woman, or assumes because the person who's been hit is behaving in an erratic manner, is slurring their words, is perhaps not as stable on their feet as they might have been expected to be, that's written off as related to substance use, rather than quite legitimately an injury to the brain. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about mental health challenges. I think the big thing that is really important for frontline to understand is that to expect a massive overlap in this population between PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And we've got this cute little picture here because I really like this one. And in fact, I need to rework it because I actually think it's a little bit, the overlap section in the middle is a little bit generous. I think there are in fact fewer overlap conditions. There are a couple, separate conditions. There are a couple of things that belong only to TBI or only to PTSD, and we wouldn't really expect to see a lot of overlap. But for the most part, you're getting a significant amount of challenge that looks exactly the same. The thing that you want to look out for in my thinking, what I'm telling Frontline is, if you've got somebody experiencing nightmares and flashbacks, chances are that's a PTSD component. It does happen in traumatic brain injury. It's not unheard of. It's not impossible, but it's not the first thing that we would leap to when we're talking to somebody and they're trying to understand whether or not they've been exposed to a brain injury of some nature. And on the flip side of that, when it comes to mild traumatic brain injury or more serious, mild to moderate, we're looking for those physical symptoms. So nausea, vomiting, dizziness, those ones, generally speaking, are not going to be associated with PTSD on the whole. Those are the ones that would start to be the red flags. But really, it's very much like what Eve said. Anytime that you're speaking with someone that you know has been exposed to physical violence to the head, face, or neck, they've been strangled, they've been thrown down a flight of stairs, they've been punched, kicked, any of the above, and anything about consciousness, concentration ability, memory, feeling different than they did before, that's a common one. I just don't feel like myself. That kind of conversation, the first thing that's going to come running through my brain is, okay, are we looking at traumatic brain injury? Next slide, please. Depression and anxiety, huge. It's another one. It's massively overrepresented in the traumatic brain injury population. And it's a chicken and an egg thing. I mean, are we talking about chemical imbalance? Are we talking about electrical connectivity that isn't working properly? Are we talking about people are really sad because they've lost a huge part of who they were? And all of those things together, it's very difficult to tease apart what's happening first, what's reactionary, what's biological, what is psychological. And I think for a lot of us, we're at the stage where each person is individual. We have to look at each person as an individual. Every single traumatic brain injury is unique, and everybody's context is different. And then you layer on top of that an IPV context, and it becomes even more complex, more difficult. But again, if you're seeing somebody in your office that is all of this is starting to come to light, and you're hearing one or two things about this difficulty and one or two things about that difficulty, and they've been experiencing physical violence, you want to start thinking about traumatic brain injury and start exploring that possibility. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the big question mark, which is, do we screen or not screen? And that is a big question. I used to think, absolutely, we screen, no question. We need to know, we need to diagnose, we need to be able to treat, all of those kinds of thinking. And then I started doing a lot more talking with Frontline and about their jobs and what those looked like and what they felt comfortable with. And I did a lot more talking with survivors in terms of what did they want to know and what did they not want to know and why not. And I'm now at the stage where my feeling is we just don't know enough. We know that the potential to increase their risk of exposure is high, just because we understand that this doesn't mean that they're not capable, that they're not fit. It doesn't mean that the judges and the courts, the family courts do. It doesn't mean that the lawyers understand that. Certainly doesn't mean that somebody whose goal in life is to manipulate and abuse a partner isn't going to use that information against them. And so we know that the risk factor is there. And then you turn that over and you say, well, okay, so what's the benefit? The benefit has to outweigh that cost. And I start looking around at TBI services and start thinking, okay, so we have limited services, which we know in Canada, and we're publicly funded. So, that's even different. It's an even more complex situation in the US, where you're talking about a system of private funding in many cases, and insurance challenges. And if we don't have services to offer, and even when we do, we know those services aren't trauma informed and they are not ready for this group, why are we pushing them down this road? And so that for me is a big conversation. And one of the things that we've been doing, I think, in the research world is we know that this issue exists and we know that we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it quickly. But there's an overwhelming amount of work to be done. This field is in its very infancy. There are a handful of us doing the work around the world. We're a tight team, and we spend a lot of time talking to each other and collaborating, and that's fantastic because it means more gets done. But we need to prioritize. And I think where I'm at the moment talking with Frontline in Canada is to say, let's move away a little bit from, do we screen and diagnose for treatment purposes? Let's move a little bit away from that model until we can get closer to, here we have a viable tool for you to use, and into a conversation about what do you need to know to understand the person who's across from you in order to be able to accommodate their needs and support them adequately moving forward. And in that sense, if you can move the next slide, we get a lot closer to that list of questions that Eve was talking about. You can skip this one because Eve talked about this too. So we're talking then about what do you need to know? You need to know, has she been experiencing physical violence to the head, face, or neck? Has there been a loss of consciousness? Is she experiencing some of those hot issues in terms of memory, headaches, concentration challenges, the sort of the top tier of traumatic brain injury? And what does that mean for her? What's happening in her world? Is she having challenges parenting her children? Is she having difficulties getting paperwork done because she's got a court appearance? So those kinds of things, you need to understand what you're dealing with so that you can fix those relationship challenges and those communication issues, so that you're in a position to be able to better support the person that you're working with and get them access to the kinds of services that they need in order to accommodate their life as a person with a brain that functions just a little bit differently than people might expect. Next slide, please. We're on the what can you do about it section. And this little baby is one of my favorite pictures. If you take a step back, you can see the elephant. If all you ever look at is the trunk or the tusk or the tail, that's all you're ever going to see. And I think that's a really good image for this particular issue. Take a step back. Don't assume that you've got somebody who's using substances and that's why they're the way they are. Don't assume that the woman is defiant and that's why she's not doing her best to do her job in order to get better. Don't assume that because women don't leave, it means they want to stay. Right? There are all those kinds of things. Take a step back from the situation. Do your best to look at it from the perspective of, okay, how can I understand what's happening and how can I support this person? Because I know that the front lines want to do that. That's very clear to us at this stage. So we're all about trying to figure out how to enable that. Next slide, please. This is my perfect world slide. I get calm just looking at this one. This is what Eve is talking about. Dim the lights, get rid of the background noise. Make it simple, make it quiet, make it peaceful. If you can make your world and her world look like this slide and make you feel like this slide makes you feel, you're halfway there. Next slide, please. This was what Eve was talking about as well. Simplification, slow it down, unlike my current presentation. Ask what she understood, not if she understood. So you're getting that feedback back from her, talking about how she's processed what you're talking to her about. Keep your sessions short and simple. Call ahead with appointment reminders. Make it easy for them to remember. Next slide. Resources for you to use. If you flip to the next slide, we built a toolkit, and I'm going to leap through as fast as possible. This is all the people who paid for it. The Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Department of Justice, the Ontario Neurotrauma is helping us expand it right now. University of Toronto and Laurier were in partnership together doing this. And then we have a number of community-based partners because I do community-based research. So Women at the Center, the Cridge Center for the Family in BC, Canada, and Women's Habitat, which is a shelter organization in Toronto, and the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. You can move to the next slide. We wanted to develop a toolkit that people could use. So we did that. We spoke with stakeholders from across the country. We talked to frontline, we talked to program managers, we talked to survivors. What do you need to know? How do you want us to put it together for you? Next slide. That's basically what we asked. What do you want in it, and what do you want it to look like? Next slide. And we built the Abused and Brain Injured Toolkit. So can I get you to go to abitoolkit.ca or .com on your screen and bring that up? And we will together walk people through this.
Absolutely. I'm going to access that link and share my screen again.
Super. Thank you for your help on this.
Of course.
You should all know I'm a technological dinosaur. I'm the joke of everybody in our organization. Eve is forever, or not Eve, Catherine is forever despairing of me and my lack of social media usage. It's because I'm a dinosaur and I can't do these things. So I'm very grateful for your help, and we'll at least get you a quick run through. So this is the toolkit. And it is designed primarily as an educational toolkit for people who are working frontline. But we kept in mind that lots of different people would be looking at it. It is live, it is free. Anybody can end up here. So we wanted to make it comfortable and usable for lots of different people. If you scroll down this page, I'll just talk a little bit about it. That was a video that we made. Keep going, you're fine. And then we've got some sort of facts and statistics here. We've got this little image is, if you want to hold here for a second, that image is important to me. It's become actually the logo for things too. It's meant to show what happens in both the traumatic brain injury and intimate partner violence. So that fracturing, that shattering of people's lives. And then you get that piece where the two intersect and it just layers on top of each other. You can keep going. We've got some basic information along here. Just keep scrolling. And then on the bottom, we talk a little bit about who's the toolkit for, how can it be useful, that kind of thing. If you want to go up to the tabs across the top where it says stories and brain injury, if you click on Brain Injury 101, this is where we gave people the quick and dirty. So what do you need to know to understand what you're looking at and how do you support it? We've got a glossary in here. Everything is referenced, so anytime that we've got information, whenever you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you get a whole bunch of little references, which we have provided as well. They're under the Care Guidelines tab. There's a sort of research categories, so that at the time that we built this, it was up to date. I do have a stack of about another 15 or so to add to the research, but it's there. If you go to the Community tab, please. Unfortunately, this is a Canadian item, so what we did is Canadian in that sense, but you'll see that all of our provinces are listed on the left-hand side, and if I won't get you to do it now because there's not much point, but if you were to click on those, what they do is link you through to brain injury resources in every community. We were able to find some brain injury service resource for every province or territory in our country, which is impressive. In the sense that our services are not always the same depending on where you are. Lastly, let's take a quick look at the Service Provision tab. This is where we put all the things that we could think of that were really important to frontline providers that might need an answer in the next 5 minutes because their client's outside the door. So things like information on communication, mental health. I'm currently building a new module on employment. So that'll be in here as well. We've got survivor voices throughout. The stories section talks a lot about that, and it has survivor voices and their stories in it. We have messages from the clients so that, that you can see on the screen here, so that people get a sense of what people might like to tell them if they have a little bit more time. You can see some features up at the top. There are safety features up there for women, as well as the Get Help Now button, which don't click on that. It's not that it explodes, it just goes places and it's hard to get back. It goes to Women's Shelter Canada Network and an interactive map which shows all of the shelters in the country and where someone might be able to find care close to them. So feel free to use it. Merry Christmas is what I always say to people at this stage. We built it, we sent it out in the world. It's not perfect. It doesn't work for everybody. We know that there are indigenous groups that this is really not very useful to. There are cultural and ethnic sensitivities that may or may not be here. There's certainly regional aspects that are not here. We do have some American resources that are listed. If we found a toolkit that already existed, we put it in here, and there were a couple of American ones. Pink Concussions has a link here. There's some Australian information, that kind of thing. But for the most part, it is a Canadian item, and it is tailored that way. But you're welcome to use it, and I'd love to get feedback from anybody. You know, if it works for you, that's great. If it doesn't work for you, tell me that too. It's an ongoing living entity, and we're constantly working to change it and see it grow. So that's there for you, and I wish you all the best in your steps, and thank you very much for hosting us and bringing us, and I hope I haven't dragged us too long. I'm hoping that you're all still here to ask us questions.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you so much for that, Lynn Hogg. That was great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know we are just at time, but for the people who want to stay back, we really hope you do. You can stay around for a Q&A session with our amazing speakers and the Pink Concussions leadership. And you can, if you want to send these questions anonymously, you can just message Ling Hao, as some of you have already during the presentation, but you can also send messages in the chat. And Ling Hao Ling Hao. I'm sorry, I got the names muddled up. We'll just be directing them towards the speakers. Thank you. Ling Hao, over to you.
Cool. Hi. Yeah, everyone. So I'll start the Q&A session off. This is a question to Dr. Valera, and this is with respect to your "why don't they just leave" slide. This participant was asking about the consequences of trauma bonding and whether or not somebody can speak a bit about how trauma bonding plays a role in the "why don't people just leave" scenario.
Sorry, you were muted.
Yeah. Am I unmuted now?
You're muted now, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know a lot about the trauma bonding syndrome personally. So I don't know if Lynn has more expertise in that. I mean, the "why don't they just leave," it's, you know, I could literally probably talk about that for an hour more, because you know that slide has it's basically a power and control wheel that has been used in many different situations. It's not just for IPV-related TBI by any means. And I just found one power and control wheel that was kind of simple that I could use and put it up there. But I didn't make it. So it's, you know, you could go online, you can find all different types. But the bottom line is that there are so many different reasons women may not be able to leave. And it may be that they're choosing not to leave for one or more of those. And, you know, you can even say, how much of a choice is it really? You have to also remember that people are intimate partners because they care for the other person. So if I'm with somebody, I like that person. Maybe I'm in love with them. Maybe I've been in love with them. And it's not easy to just say, I'm going to leave you because you hit me. You know, if you're really in love with someone, that may be complicated as well. So that's just an example of how it could be that there's intimidation and threats and control, because abuse is really about power and control for the most part. So there are so many different reasons, but the reason I put up that slide is not necessarily to explain, you know, exactly what it is, but it's for the people, like on the radio, when I heard someone say, it was a DJ, and he said, I guess there was some star or whatever, I don't know, and I guess she had been abused in, and he's like, well, I don't know, should I really feel bad for her? I mean, she did go back to him again. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, like, first of all, like, talk about blaming the victim, right? And you don't know the reasons behind that. You don't know what happened. And then luckily the female DJ did come to her defense, whatever. just to finish that story. But the bottom line is, you know, and then I think, you know, if you're a police officer and you're coming to the scene, you know, once again, it's another domestic disturbance call. Yeah, we've been here like 5 times in the last, you know, 2 months or whatever. And they might be like, yeah, whatever. And they just want to like, you know, respond to the call, tell them to keep it down and shut the door. And, you know, and they feel like, you know, this woman should be taking more responsibility for herself. Again, victim blaming, like, you know, you don't know what's going on. And so you don't want to make assumptions about why a woman is not leaving, you know, that she's choosing to do this. You know, every situation is different and complex. And a lot of the situations, frankly, are incredibly life-threatening. And so I just like to make people aware that just like we don't know necessarily a brain injury has occurred in every instance of partner violence, it's not going to be every instance. But if there are certain things there that, you know, may look even slightly like that, entertain that idea and then find out and then rule it in around. But with respect to leaving, please don't blame the victim. Don't blame the survivor, whatever. You know, think about the you know, what you don't know is a lot in terms of what her situation is and whether or not she can actually leave.
I also wanted to add that, and again, I am not from a Black or brown community, but from the Black and brown community, the experience that has been shared with me is that inviting the police into your house is not necessarily inviting a source of help, and it's potentially putting members of your family in potentially a death squad, depending on the community and how the police in your area. So, you know, you're actually inviting another perpetrator into your house of violence.
And just to build on that, and I forget exactly where I heard it, but there was somebody who said, like, why don't you ever call the police or whatever? And they're like, because I'm not going to put another Black man in jail. And I think that's really powerful. And it goes to, you know, the age we're in now where people are finally, I mean, there's still a long way to go, but yeah, jails are overfilled with Black men who really shouldn't be there, with other people who shouldn't be there as well too. But that's, you know, if you're in that community, you know, that's a very real feeling. And I certainly don't know, you know, that feeling as well as a person of color would, but you know, I will never forget that comment.
It's also a very high risk of brain injury within prisons as well. I know that there's doctors who are doing research that as well at Bellevue. So within the criminal justice system, that risk is real and also not diagnosed and treated.
I think one of the things that's really important to remember is, and this comes from a colleague of mine, Neka McGregor, who is a very strong and powerful survivor, who started an organization called Women at the Center in Toronto, Canada, which is an advocacy and support organization that is entirely led by and for women survivors. And her point is, why do we keep asking, why don't women leave? Why aren't we asking, why do people hit? Mm-hmm. And her point is that she wants it to stop being the responsibility of the people who are being hit. She wants us to start questioning the people who are throwing the punches. And I mean, she's very point blank about that. So I always like to bring that piece forward when we have this conversation, because we always do, you know, and I think Eve is absolutely right to bring the issue forward in the slide deck and to ask people to become more aware of it. And I think part of that is raising the awareness around, why are we even asking that question? Why aren't we questioning why they're being hit in the first place? And looking at the problem from that perspective. I was just looking back in the chat function too, and I think Meredith had a question at some point about, do we know anything about perpetrators? And yes, we do. And yes, we've got a high proportion of traumatic brain injury in people throwing the punches as well. So if we're going to look at that, I think we need to look at that across the board, and we need to have compassion and empathy across the board and look at how can we make a difference? How can we stop the cycle of violence, and how can we make interventions that are going to change outcomes for everybody involved?
I also wanted to add research. Hugh Williams is doing a lot of this research in the UK, looking at women in prisons and the number of women that have experienced domestic violence that are in prisons and brain injury in prisons. And that goes for both male prison inmates and female prison inmates that brain injury and domestic violences can be a cyclical pattern that puts people incarcerated, increases the violence. They're away from their children, they come back. So it is a multi-generational societal issue that really needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've got American data on that too, Catherine. Take a look at John Corrigan's work.
Definitely.
Yeah, he's certainly looking at early childhood experiences and how that leads, traumatic brain injury in an early childhood experience leads to potential criminalization at an older age, as well as the reverse.
And we do have a call, one of the domestic violence task force calls was included the UK work on the prison system and also on mothers in prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Cool, great. Thank you so much for all of the insightful answers regarding that question. So I'll move on to another one that we've received. Are there any ways to identify who is likely to be on the inflicting end of IPVs? Or is that also more up to, or is that also more difficult to identify just because it's less easily observed?
Yeah, I think Lynn was answering that a tiny bit in that, you know, people who have experienced partner violence, well, if you look at people who perpetrate partner violence, a greater percentage of them will have brain injuries. I think in the limited data that we have. I mean, I don't think we have really good data on that, actually. We've sort of been looking at that. But I do believe that's probably the case, that people who are violent offenders tend to have, or more likely to have, histories of brain injuries. But otherwise, you know, and anyone else can speak up if they actually have looked at this and know more. But really, it's not, there's not like a, oh yeah, you know, there's not like a profession or a certain necessarily, you know, a characteristic that you can say like, oh, these people are more likely to be abusers. I mean, you can have clergy members abusing, you can have the New York District Attorney, for example, had 4 abusive partners who he really physically and sexually abused quite a bit. And he was always supportive of women's rights and tried to fight against domestic violence. So it just doesn't make any kind of sense. You know, he's the nicest guy in the world, you'll hear. And meanwhile, back at home, he's beating the crap out of his wife or partner. So I think that's really hard. You know, if, you know, the only thing I would say is, you know, abuse is about power and control. So if you see someone who overtly, you know, in a situation is like very controlling or certain, you know, basically of their partner, you know, even in a public situation, you know, maybe they're more likely to be abusive, but that's certainly not going to say, oh yeah, that person is. So we really don't know a lot as far as I know. And again, I want anyone else to pipe up, but I mean, like, I guess what I usually try to say, and I actually have a slide on this, but it's just, you know, for time and interest, abusers can be anyone, and they really are. And you know, just because somebody's the CEO of a company or seems to be a great guy in the community doesn't mean he's not doing really bad stuff at home. Or she. I mean, it goes both ways. I apologize. I do focus on, you know, women as being the survivors or the victims, men as the perpetrators. That's largely what I've seen. But obviously, it can go all different ways. Women are disproportionately more likely to be injured because the size differential, et cetera. But anyway. So.
Meredith, I'm just reading your comment in the chat here about the clinical setting and providers being alerted to a dynamic. And I think that's a good way of looking at it in terms of what Eve is saying. There isn't a big scary monster that's always going to be the person who's throwing the punches, kind of thing. You can't typecast them in that sense. But there are behaviors that you can look for, and both from a professional perspective, you know, if you're hearing those sort of markers in the conversation, if you're noticing that someone is being controlled or talks about being controlled, and what we hear from what I hear from survivors every time I'm talking to them is, why didn't somebody ask me? If somebody would have asked me, I would have told them. And what I find really surprising about that is that we're still not asking.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I sit here and think, what? Why can you say that to me? But if that's what they're telling me, then that's what's happening. So we need to be asking, we need to work harder at making safe spaces for women and for whoever is experiencing violence to come forward. One of the things that came out in our early research that has always stuck with me is survivors saying, why aren't we educating X-ray technicians? And I said, you know, okay. And they said, that's the one place in a hospital I can guarantee that there's only me and the medical professional in the room. And it's simple when you think about it. Any other space, potentially, the abuser can be with them. And they don't have a safe zone, no matter how hard you've tried. I've talked to Frontline who's made the assumption that because two women are coming in, it's not the abuser with the person who's been hit. And that's an assumption that we just should not be making. So it's really about it's really about thinking exactly what she's talking about there. It's that dynamic. Where is it possible that you could be seeing somebody in that situation, and how do you create a safe zone for them to do it? And there are lots of things going on in the world right now, particularly under COVID, where we're really working at developing new and creative ways to create that safe space for women, because a lot of them are very cut off from the methods and the mechanisms that they may have had before. And I think that's really important to remember right now.
And just to follow up a tiny bit, one of the things that I do, and I tried to do at the beginning of my talk, is really, it's a very stigmatizing topic. And I think what we really need to be doing as a society is making this less stigmatizing. You know, people can talk about having a broken arm, right? And that's okay. They go to the doctor because they have a broken arm, but you don't want to talk about if your partner's abusing you. I mean, and there's reasons for that. It's kind of embarrassing to think, you know, like, but the reason it's embarrassing is because it's basically saying that you screwed up. You shouldn't be with that person. And again, we want to get away from that. We don't want that to be. We just want to be like, oh my gosh, he did that to you. This is, you know, like it shouldn't be that they feel like this is on me. And I think that's part of the reason it's stigmatizing. And that's one of the reason people don't want to bring it up. But it's not on the person who's being abused. It's you know, on the person who's abusing, and why are they abusing? And you know, you know, they have the problem, but now they're creating a problem for somebody else. But there's a saying that I heard too, from this dude, whatever, who was talking about he had childhood abuse or sexual abuse, I think. And he wanted to raise awareness. He said, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think that's a really nice way to think about this in a way, because I had someone tell me one time, or not me, but it was in the feedback from a lecture that I gave at a conference. And one of the comments was like, oh, the talk made me really uncomfortable. It's like, yeah, it should. I mean, if it doesn't make you a little uncomfortable, I mean, you should be uncomfortable hearing this stuff, hearing that people are treated this way, and at such great numbers, and we're not doing anything about it. You know, so anyway, but I think that, you know, just like Lynn was saying, you know, like an X-ray technician is a nice idea, but also just like at a party, you know, it may not be, like, oh, this is a fun topic, but you know, if you have a good friend, you know, talk about. I mean, COVID is a little different, but you know, it can be part of the everyday conversation. You know, are you feeling okay? Are you safe today? You know, has anything happened? You know. Whatever, as the stress, and especially in COVID, I'll shut up after this, but one of the things that I think is a great opportunity for people who want to help and think that somebody may be in a bad situation is COVID provides that to say, you know, man, I've found out like in COVID, you know, people being together all the time, it's created a lot of stress and all this other stuff going on. And you know, relationships, there's a lot of abuse going on in relationships. Are you okay? I just want to check in because I know it's often hidden. And that could be one way to do exactly what we want to do here. So COVID's going to be around for a little while. So, I mean, if all of us sort of stepped up and just sort of started talking to our friends like that, at least we might be moving it a little bit in the right direction.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for all the insightful answers there. So on the next question then, can you speak a bit about the comorbidity of PTSD with TBIs and how those two are interrelated?
Well, yeah, I mean, aside from anything else, somebody once said to me, how are you going to tease them apart? And I said, well, I'm not sure I can. They're very, very similar conditions. And I would expect in this group, people to be displaying both challenges. And in a lot of cases, you don't really need to tease them apart, in the sense that a lot of what we're doing to support people with TBI or to support people with PTSD is very similar. So you got a good path going no matter what you do, kind of basically. But there are some things that we can do for traumatic brain injury survivors that we wouldn't do for PTSD. And there are some things that we would do for PTSD that we might think twice about with traumatic brain injury, particularly around medications. So I think it is important. I do think it's more important to understand that distinction now. So I think that's a great question. You really have a lot of things overlapped. So your depression, your anxiety, the sort of the cognitive impairment, PTSD certainly can have an impairment on somebody's cognitive capacities, on their concentration, on their memory, their ability to recall, their ability to store, the sort of the triggering aspects of things. All of those things, it wouldn't surprise me either way, depending on what you're looking at. The piece that I think really stands out are the nightmares and flashbacks. Those, unless you've got somebody whose traumatic brain injury was acquired through a psychologically traumatic event, that isn't something I would necessarily expect to see. So somebody playing hockey who falls over, who's not even in a fight, but who just falls over backwards and hits their head on the ice, that's not someone I would expect to see flashbacks and nightmares in. That's when I'm starting to think, okay, so what else is going on in your life that's generating that particular issue? The piece around the nausea, the vomiting, the headaches, that group of physical symptoms, that's where I start to think a lot more about traumatic brain injury. Now, it doesn't rule out, everybody physicalizes and processes emotional challenges in different ways. I wouldn't rule it out, but it wouldn't be my first go-to on that circumstance. Eve, do you have more to add to that in terms of the overlap?
I think part of, in terms of, it depends on where the question is coming from and why. So I think ultimately, you can, labels and diagnoses are good for people to be able to communicate and understand something, but you still have the person that's right in front of you. And so what I would do is, whatever it is, it almost doesn't matter if you know exactly what it is, or it might be this or that, but you want to identify what it is. So for example, if there's cognitive issues, do some neuropsych testing. It doesn't matter if it's coming from the PTSD or the head injury. If there's attentional issues, you still want to know what's going on and what their strengths and weaknesses are. You do want to know if there's some psychological, it's nice to know if they've definitely had a brain injury, or if, they have a traumatic event. You want to be able to address both of those issues. So for example, you don't want to just say, oh, it's all in your head, because you assume it's not a brain injury. But I think you want to look at the person as a whole, and then try to do your best to treat it, which may include a combination of treatment for, psychological, if they're saying, like Lynn was saying, some things are not, you're not going to see in you're not going to see in TBI, for example. I mean, if you're having flashbacks and stuff, treat the flashbacks. If you're having cognitive issues, treat the cognitive issues. So that's kind of my answer. I and without knowing more about where the question's coming from.
I just threw up a slide that
I like this one, Catherine.
at some of the military conferences, and in a work group, all of these can be moved around. Like, I think no one completely agrees, but this is, throwing spaghetti at a wall. This is kind of what the separations are, but then you could really dive down the way. I think, Lynn, you really described it well, how different humans, some people get diarrhea from stress. Other people, that would be definitely a sign of the flu, or is it COVID? We all process things in different ways.
And I think for whoever it was who asked the question, if you're interested in it from a sort of a more scientific perspective, or you really would like, more solid answers than we've been able to throw out for you, take a look at Catherine Iverson's work. She's been interested in PTSD and traumatic brain injury in the IPV population. Now, she's looking mostly through a military lens, but you know, just because somebody got their brain injury from a partner who is also in the military doesn't mean it isn't, you know, doesn't mean there isn't a lot of overlap. So Catherine's work is really good. She's certainly cutting edge on that. And she's published 2 or 3 papers, I think, that fall into that category. So if whoever that is looking for specifics on that, probably we can get you that. My guess is they're on my toolkit. Although Catherine's most recent one might not be there, but you can get word through to me, and I can get the articles to you if that's what you'd like.
And I also put up the call that when we had Leanne Bruce from the National Program Manager for Intimate Partner Violence at the VA, and Tara Gavinsky, who's the Women's Health Division, National Center for PTSD. And one of the reasons why our first recruitment brain bank was for the VA's PTSD brain bank is we wanted a brain bank that was also looking at PTSD.
It's a really important issue. And I think one of the things that I suspect, just, you know, as a researcher who spends a lot of time reading about this stuff, is that probably what's happened is we have been misdiagnosing TBI as PTSD in this particular group for a very long time. So we thought we were seeing PTSD, and when in fact it's just a little bit more complex and a little bit more layered than that.
Yeah, no, I think you know, you're exactly right, Lynn. I mean, you know, it's like historically there's like the battered woman syndrome and all these other things, and yeah, no one's ever thinking, oh, maybe she has a head injury. You know, I mean, it wasn't even really considered, you know, prior to, you know, 30 years ago. You know, so it's just, I think historically we know the women have had the same symptoms that they have now, and we know women have getting the crap kicked out of them, you know, for forever. And actually there's if you look at Catherine Snedeker posted a link to a paper on the chat about this paper. What's the name of it, Catherine? What's the name of it? Where is it?
The boxer and the punch drunk wife.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting historical perspective. Yeah. And basically showing, you know, there's, you know, just how wives were just like considering, you know, like he went home and he, you know, it would be like a joke that he could like punch his wife so many times. You know, people aren't thinking, oh, maybe they're sustaining brain injuries. They're just not even thinking about it. So anyway, I think you hit the nail on the head, Lynn, that, you know, I think there's been a lot of misdiagnoses. But we need to study this. That's what we need to figure out. You know, I mean, like that's what we need to be doing. We need to.
Yeah, we need a lot more researchers and a lot more money and some time.
Yeah, because for now we're basically saying we think, just like with the CTE. Yeah. We think, you know, I'd be surprised if there wasn't something like that, you know, in people who have been battered so much. But we don't know.
I do think the history is very important. And Stephen and Donald, I forgot Donald's first name, but both of them wrote this paper on the boxer and the punch drunk wife. And just what it basically talked about is a man comes in with brain injury and it's about the physical characteristics of his brain injury. A woman comes in with a brain injury and it's about her psychological weakness or her trauma. And only when those are resolved, you know, a woman's pain is always seen from a psychological lens as opposed to a physical lens. She has to prove she's not wacko before you're like, oh yeah, you know, you've got a cut on your leg. It's not that you're just traumatized. And just to take it out of the traumatic brain injury IPV world, one of the next, what I hope to do next year is to speak to the UN and to talk to different disaster relief organizations that are very much about trauma but have not screened people for TBI. So that if you have a natural disaster, an earthquake, and people are looking around stunned and traumatized, how many of those people are brain injuries because the roof of wherever they are is just fallen on their head? So I think brain injury has been sort of the ugly stepchild of the neurological world. It is not cool. There aren't great pharmaceutical solutions. There isn't a lot of money to be made in it. And we tend to move towards things like breast cancer, where Chemotherapy is expensive. There's not a lot of profit in brain injury. There's not a lot of profit in helping people with domestic violence. COVID has made domestic violence and IPV newsworthy. So in a sense, I think that is maybe, if there's a silver lining to COVID, you just put in COVID and domestic violence and suddenly there's an international push that nobody funded, that nobody came up with. There isn't a gala behind it. So I think, you know, it is a time to really push forward and make some of those advances.
Lori, I just want to respond to the comment that you put in there about so many people having PTSD after TBI, and you're not wrong on that, absolutely. They're often interlinked, as I say, but the distinction that we're making here is the sort of TBI in and of itself is unlikely to be in a relationship with PTSD. If what you're sort of looking at is a clean TBI, and that's in terms of, you know, that's all about how you get it. So when you talk about traumatic brain injury, it's not that we use that traumatic term in a psychological sense. We're talking about, has there been a trauma, a physical trauma to the head and or neck in order to cause, has there been an impact? Has somebody been shaken? Has there, did they slip and fall? That kind of thing. So that's the way in which we use the word traumatic in that sense, rather than a psychologically traumatic event. The reality is that many of the ways that people have that much physical impact to their head is a psychologically traumatic event. And so then, yes, quite easily you would get both conditions together, particularly when you're looking at IPV, criminalized populations, substance use challenge populations, homeless populations, veterans, all of those sort of more traumatizing environments that would also go with a brain injury. So just so that was clear, I just didn't want you to think that you had the wrong information at some point, and that, you know, I came along and stomped on that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for the answers. I'll turn it over to Tariq. If we had a few more questions, but just because of timing, we have to end it here. And those questions will be addressed on both the Pink Concussions and Columbia Synapse's website for those answers. But I'll turn it back to Tariq for the closing statements.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for drawing on this insights. Really, really appreciate that. Thanks, Eve and Linhog. And thank you to the Pink Concussions leadership, Catherine and Kara both, for putting up a great event. This draws on a really, really important issue during COVID-19. Catherine, you already spoke to this. This got international attention, and it's an issue that has not really, it's been neglected in the past. And Pink Concussions is doing such great work in bringing light to it and providing resources to people who are affected by it. And in light of that, there were some questions, like Linkow said, that were not could not be answered just because of time limitations. But Kara and Pink Concussions has been pretty great. And they promised that they would be able to respond to these questions at a later time. And they will be able to post this on their website, and I will post the link to that website. And we will also post the answers to these questions on our website too, so the Columbia Synapse website. So yeah, that is all for the event. But if you have any closing statements to the speakers or to the Pink Concussions leadership, I'll hand it over to you.
I would just like to say thank you.
Yeah.
Eric and Bertina, thank you so much for working with me, and I'm glad that we were able to coordinate this. This was, a follow-up to the conference that has been, that was postponed by Columbia Synapse that will be rescheduled for March, but I'm really glad that we were able to work together and address this topic. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much for working with us. It's really been our pleasure. Bertina and I have really enjoyed working with you, and this has been fantastic getting to know you too. Thank you so much, Carol.
Thank you.
Thank you. And also, we will just post the links to the websites and the chat windows, so just stay tuned for that. Great, I just posted it there in the chat window. Oh wait, sorry. I just posted it. That's the Pink Concussions website, and the Columbia Synapse website is this. Again, if your questions were not answers, you can feel free to reach out to any of the great leadership at Pink Concussions, at Columbia Synapse, but you can also check out our website in due time with answers to some of the questions that were unanswered. And yeah, we'll be in touch with all the attendees. Thank you so much for coming to the event. This was a really important issue, and we we're so excited that you were able to join us to learn more.
Thanks so much.
All right, bye.
Have a great weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.